Police arrest hundreds around the world in an unprecedented sting operation. Their weapon, an app they controlled. So what are the implications for law enforcement? Will new tech keep police ahead of criminals? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. For 3 years, many in the criminal underworld thought they were operating under the radar. Organised crime gangs plotted drug deals, money laundering, even murder. They had no idea detectives were monitoring them the entire time. Police arrested hundreds of suspects in a global operation called Trojan Shield. As the name suggests, it involved a bit of trickery. The gangs thought they were messaging on a secure encrypted platform called Anom, but the app was controlled by Australian police and the FBI. It gave law enforcement agents an unprecedented insight into criminal activity, as Paul Brennan explains.
The global police raids have included the Italian mafia, Asian crime syndicates, drugs cartels and illegal motorcycle gangs. More than 800 arrests in 16 different countries. The criminal gangs thought that their communications were encrypted and secure. What they didn't know was that the devices, called Anom, had been developed by the FBI in collaboration with Australian and European police.
The criminals using these devices believed they were secretly planning crimes far beneath the radar of law enforcement. But in reality, the criminals were not underneath the radar. They were on it.
Criminal gangs today rely on secure digital communication, and the FBI plan was a real slow burner. The first handful of compromised Anom devices were quietly supplied to criminals in Australia around 18 months ago and built up a solid reputation among the criminal underworld. Then, when law enforcement knocked out the rival EncroChat and Sky ECC networks earlier this year, more than 12,000 of the compromised Anom devices were in circulation all around the globe. Multi-million-dollar international crime empires were now openly visible to the FBI and police.
On Anom, criminals communicated in 45 languages about things like trafficking in drugs, arms and explosive, ram raid, ATM gas attacks, armed robberies, and last but not least, contract killings.
The coordinated raids around the globe have found more than 32 tons of various illegal drugs. Hundreds of firearms and weapons have been recovered, and nearly $150 million in cash and cryptocurrency has been seized.
It's the third encrypted mobile phone network to be compromised by law enforcement within a very short period of time, and I expect others are coming. So, who can you trust?
There are still criminal networks in existence. There are other illicit communications networks still operating. But when police chiefs call this operation a watershed moment in global law enforcement, it's difficult to disagree. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring our guests into the show now then. We have joining us from Boston, Glenn Carle, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats at the National Intelligence Council. In Cardiff, Michael Levi, Professor of Criminology at Cardiff University. And in Alexandria, Virginia, Arthur Rizer, former US Department of Justice Prosecutor. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Glenn. So this is quite an innovative and creative approach. It's almost like something out of a movie. How did it all come about?
Well, I don't know the details of this specific operation, but although it is creative, and I'm happy to be able to talk for once about a real triumph and dramatic success of the FBI, law enforcement, intelligence, and international cooperation. It's not an unusual operation in many ways. I have worked closely with the Bureau for decades, and they can do simply spectacular work. Law enforcement is what they do. The agency tends to find fault with them more frequently on intelligence issues because that's our bailiwick and there are rivalries and so on. But in law enforcement, they can be spectacular.
But this seems to be at another level, isn't it, Glenn? This seems to be quite unprecedented to convince the criminals to actually, well, basically turn themselves into informants.
Well, that's not surprising. I think the extent is surprising, since this seems to span 17 countries at least, or I forget the exact number, but it's really global, with hundreds, 800 people arrested in a whole range of criminal activities. So the scope, I think, is surprising, at least to me. But that there be multilateral law enforcement operations, this happens frequently, and it's a joy, frankly, to be able to speak about one of these successes, since all of us only become aware most of the time of the problems that my colleagues sometimes have. So
All right.
I'm surprised at the scope, but not at the nature.
I think I have the number. It's 18 countries, hundreds of arrests in 18 countries. Professor Michael, how much of a blow has this dealt to organized crime? Is this a knockout punch for them?
I'm afraid it's not a knockout punch, but it will have been a blow. And one of the things that I'd like to see going forwards is a lot more analysis of what it tells us about the nature of criminal organization and crime networks and money laundering networks, because it's relatively rare. I accept what was said earlier, but it's relatively rare that you get this kind of unalloyed real world, as opposed to relayed by informants, insight into the kinds of discussions that offenders were having amongst themselves. And it will lead to a lot more distrust of technology by offenders, and in that respect, it's a punch. But we have yet to see what impact it'll have on criminal markets. I mean, it's a terrific law enforcement triumph, and it's a very unusual in terms of scale. But whether it will really stop that many more drugs getting on the streets or that many frauds from happening, it's already disrupted some killings, and that's a good thing for sure. But the longer term impacts on criminal markets, we don't yet know about.
Arthur, how much insight has it given authorities into the world of global crime, organized crime? I mean, as Professor Michael said, it's rare that you have this sort of level of direct access, you know, not going through. I mean, I guess in the old days, law enforcement would work maybe for years just to plant one informer or informant inside a network. And now suddenly you have a lot of people giving you firsthand what they're talking about. Is this a new level of insight, Arthur?
Yeah, you have all the details. Yeah, you have all the details. You don't have to fill in the gaps. I mean, often when you're building, I was a federal prosecutor, you're building huge cases, you have to fill in a lot of the details that you think that are there. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is they closed the trap. Now, I would like to know why they closed the trap. And I'm speculating, but it's probably because they had something really big that happened, because this would be an incredible tool to be able to use and continue to use. And just because you can't necessarily prosecute each case that comes that enters your trap, there's other law enforcement tools that you can use in order to make this effective. For instance, you can take little bits and pieces of the information you gather and you can trickle it out to different law enforcement agencies across the world. But because they closed the entire loop on this, I would suspect there is something major that happened where they knew that they wanted to kind of lay it out, or maybe it was breached at some point and it was going to come out that this was going on. I think one of the most unique aspects of this is exactly what you were kind of getting into, is that.
All right, Professor Michael wanted to say something. Go ahead, Professor.
I think it was partly that the security had been breached, but it was also that some of the permissions in some of the jurisdictions were expiring, and I think they wanted to do a big concerted push, which is what's generated all this massive international.
Well, that's an interesting point.
I am sure there are people that are disappointed about that. I think that a lot of people that I'm sure wanted this to keep going. This is a very unique and impressive. We've been tricking bad guys for a long time. I remember, working on a case where we, basically told people they won a prize, and all they had to do was show up and claim it, and it was just warrants for their arrest. And they all showed up, and we arrested them. But it was interesting to see the scope of this. It's quite impressive.
Glenn, here's maybe along those lines, a statement that's been made by some of the Australian officials was to the effect that, hey, we always knew that there was going to come a particular point, a day when we'd need to shut this down. From your experience in intelligence work, shall we say, what imposes that expiry date? Is it a breach, or is it an expiry of your ability or some license or warrant?
Well, warrants is certainly the case, sometimes an issue for the law enforcement people, less so for us in the intelligence community, purely intelligence community. But like our colleague said a moment ago, when I first heard about this, one of my initial reactions was, well, a lot of people are not going to be happy. No operations officer ever wants to reveal the source or the method, because then it is compromised and you can't use it again. So there were compelling reasons. I think a couple were mentioned, such as there might have been events that needed to be stopped and could only be done so by acting, or warrants were expiring, or there might have been freedom of information requests that came into play. I don't know, but the reasons must have been compelling, because you wouldn't want to give up this kind of tool. If I could add one point, I think this clearly is a triumph, but like our colleagues have said, I'll echo, it's not I think a medium-term powerful success, meaningful. Short-term, of course, it's a big problem for the people who have been detained. Long-term, well, so long as there is a demand, people will find a way to provide a supply. And that fundamentally is the issue. I spoke with the head of our Naval Forces Coast Guard counter-narcotics operations for the southern part of the United States, and he told me he had, this is a few years ago, 12 ships to cover an area going from, I think, North Carolina to the tip of South America. That's a lot of water to cover with 12 ships. And the head of the Counter-Narcotics Center told me one time that all the operations that that institution and the FBI had done over the years had never materially affected the price of any illegal drug on the street. So long as there's a demand, people will be creative and will have to use a new iteration of what we've just discovered.
Professor Michael, can law enforcement continue to use this technique going forward now that the cat's out the bag?
Well, I think they'll have to find a similar entree. I mean, yeah, for the smooth running of a criminal enterprise, they would want that level of kind of, as they believe it, secret interchange, which smooths the path of offender cooperation. But so I think that creates the opportunity for the insertion of this kind of technique. So people on both sides will be searching both to insert it and to stop it being inserted. But like the sting operations that were mentioned earlier, they have a disruptive effect for a while. And then, if you like, the need for criminal collaboration generates its own demand. And if the authorities can produce the supply, then this sort of thing might happen again.
So this might continue. Arthur, are there any civil liberties issues to think about here? When you're traditionally doing, maybe, shall we call it traditional law enforcement sort of spying and eavesdropping, you might need to get clearance from a judge, a court order. You might need, if you're trying to use one of the existing apps, to go through the company, WhatsApp, Viber, and say, hey, can you give us access? But if you own the app yourself and if you push it out for wider and wider use, do you see any lack of oversight here?
Yeah. I mean, this is the debate that we have to have. And when you volunteer and you avail yourself to an app, you do lose some of those rights. I mean, one of the issues that I kind of see is that, our laws, especially in the United States, are really designed, and they're still written for the old, trap and trace and Title III wiretaps, where you're operators literally plugging plugs into different holes in order to connect lines. And that is the way that our Title III, which is our wiretap law, and other laws were drafted. And many countries have kind of modeled their laws after ours. One of the issues with this is because technology has changed so quickly, is that we don't really have the civil liberty trail is not really keeping up. I don't know if there was any judicial interference or oversight over this this law. Now, there will be on the prosecutorial side. Something Glenn said that was really profound was he talked about the procedures and the source and methods is really one of the things that they want to protect. And there's always that tension between intelligence and law enforcement, because intelligence wants to protect source and methods, law enforcement wants to put bad guys in jail, and that tension is usually where civil liberties comes to play. We have SIPA and Classified Information Procedure Act, which allows us to do certain things behind the veil. But at the end of the day, if we want to put bad people in prison in the United States, we have to release discovery. And I think one of the things about this effort is because now it's in the open, they can actually do discovery. And because they can do discovery, they can actually start putting people in prison. And that is key. Now, the civil liberty aspect of it, we're constantly having that interplay between civil liberties, technology, and the way that bad guys do business. And it's a very hard race to keep up with. I do enjoy the fact that for once I'm reading a cyber story where we're on the offensive instead of being on the defensive, which is the last year. All it's been has been defensive. So this is great news in regards.
I'd like to add a point on the civil liberties, if I could.
Please go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom in the United States and everywhere, really, certainly for 20 years and perhaps for far longer than that, has been that the U.S. intelligence community, specifically, this is one of concern to me from my career, of course, is a threat to the civil liberties and has broken the law and ignored them, flaunted its power as opposed to its obligations. And repeated independent analyses of the national security agencies, those are the people who tap phones and capture radio transmissions and so on, or the intelligence officers in the CIA who have human operations or do physical penetrations of a facility, say, have somehow infringed civil liberties. But all of the studies have shown that of the dozens of millions of instances of taps of conversations or something, I think there were 80 instances that broke the law, and 75 or something of those were inadvertent and then rectified. They were expunged or were not used in any way. And I can tell you from firsthand experience.
Glenn, we're talking about the known and analyzed cases, though, right?
Oh, well, that dramatically mischaracterizes, actually, not intentionally, the extent of the analysis. I think it was the Congress or the Department of Justice or an independent investigator or all of the above looked at several of the national security agencies' programs and found that actually they did not, in almost any case, break the law. What they did was, and this is objectionable to many, but it's not illegal, was they would capture transmissions, say. So you call me or I call somebody in Europe, but they did not use it. It's sitting somewhere
We're getting into metadata,
it can only be accessed. It can only be accessed if there is probable cause.
All right.
It's not even used.
Let's come. I mean, that's a big discussion about the capture of metadata in the picture you can or cannot form about someone and how intrusive that is and how legal or not. But Professor, I'm wondering, does it make sense? I mean, if law enforcement was already putting this program together, might you be tempted to think that they may have also thought about stage 2 already? There may be other apps which are already out there. Should we assume that this was the only one that they thought to put together?
Well, I mean, that's the lurking doubt that they're hoping to keep in the minds of offenders so that they won't use the next one unless they have it, in which case, I mean, don't forget, one of the rival apps was called Sky Global, and the authorities raided that and closed it down, and that drove more offenders towards the Anon one.
Exactly.
So
how do we know that authorities will only use this to spy on who we call the bad guys, to spy on suspected criminals?
Yeah, I mean that seems to be the objective. I mean, as I understand it, the FBI did not use this in a widespread way within the United States, and that's one of the reasons why this is such a big international case, because of concerns about powers and intrusive surveillance.
I mean, if you're giving out 12,000 handsets, is it inconceivable somebody might give one out to, I don't know, someone a mistress or somebody that's, not directly involved in criminal activity?
Yeah, but given the very limited
rules.
Oh, okay, let Professor Michael finish the thought, and then we'll come to you, Arthur.
Given the utility, the very limited utility of these particular handsets, which didn't have any other, realistically, any other apps on them, it wouldn't have been much use to a sexual partner, except for communicating with one of the principals. So I don't think that was that much of a risk in this particular
All right,
case.
go ahead, Arthur.
Yeah, we have minimization. I mean, I used to teach minimization for the DEA and FBI agents, and there are strict rules about how you minimize conversations that are not relevant out. But the thing that actually does most of the protection is the
who
fact
has
that
those strict rules? Hang on, Arthur.
That,
who has those strict rules?
Yeah.
Is this? Are you talking
the Department of Justice
agencies,
has,
or is there any
minimization
oversight?
rules. Yeah. It is an internal rule, but I was going to say that the most protection comes from just the man hours. We do not have the hours in the day to listen to conversations between lovers. And my experience is when you're hearing conversations between lovers or attorneys and their clients, they turn the conversation off, because it's not just because of the minimization. It's because they're actively trying to get evidence in order to proceed with intelligence in cases, and they just don't have the time to listen to all that. I mean, there is a body on the end of every single one of these conversations reading these things. And then when you're talking about international, then you have all the translators involved. We do have some computer programs that can help out, look for buzzwords, but I'll tell you, bad guys are really sophisticated. I mean, I cannot tell you the coding system that the cartels would use in order to come up and talk about their business in a way that we couldn't recognize. But at the end of the day, man hours plays a huge part into ensuring that we are on the things that are important to us.
Okay, Glenn, man hours, internal rules, that might be, it might work well in theory. Is there a need to have some independent oversight if this is a thing of the future, that, not only criminals are going to have to go deeper and deeper into this kind of technology, but law enforcement will? Is there a need to have some independent oversight?
Well, there is. I mean, there's always a dilemma in intelligence. How do you keep something secret and have an outside oversight, which is required for objectivity and fairness? And in the U.S. system, we have twisted ourselves into knots trying to solve this dilemma. But I think it's done pretty well, actually. One, all the institutions truly are profoundly law-abiding, and if an officer breaks the law or does something questionable, he or she will, at the very least, suffer. And how is this ascertained? Because there are inspector generals who travel around from station to station, office to office, all the time, and they conduct their reports, and they are powerful, and they do their jobs very well. Supervisors will have huge consequences if they have allowed something to occur. One little
Glenn Snowden might have something slightly different perspective on some of that, of course, though, because all of that is sort of internal relying, isn't it?
Well, the only oversight outside, ultimately, is the Department of Justice. And that's only, I don't mean to minimize, it's the Department of Justice and our elected officials, the oversight committees, who are empowered to take all sorts of steps to make sure that people like me don't break the law. And it really is a rare occurrence when it happens. One quick anecdote, it will only be a moment.
Very quickly, Glenn, because we're running out of time. Yeah, go ahead, very quickly.
If an American name or person was heard on an intercept of a conversation and we didn't have a warrant, we literally had to stop the listening. We could not do it. And so even if we gave up information, we just couldn't do it.
All right, it's a really fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we could go on for another hour, but we are out of time. So let's thank our guests. I'm sure we'll be back anyway, guys, to talk about this in the not too distant future. Let's thank Glenn Carle, Michael Levy, and Arthur Rizer. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again and all of our previous programs anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here for now, it's goodbye.